7 minutes in Cell Block 4. Part 1. The Echo of the Iron Key. The Eastern State Penitentiary stood like a crumbling stone fortress in the heart of Philadelphia, a monument to a failed experiment in human isolation and spiritual breakage. Its radiating cell blocks were designed to force a man to look inward until he found a path to redemption, but most men found only the screaming void of their own fractured minds. Elias Thorne, a night security guard with a penchant for the building's darkest histories, walked the perimeter of Cell Block 4 with a heavy flashlight that cut through the thick dust of the corridors. Unlike the rest of the prison, which was open to the occasional tour group, Block 4 remained under a permanent seal of neglect and shadows. The air here was different from the rest of the facility. It was thick and stagnant, smelling of lime, old sweat, and a dry electric tension that made the hair on his arms stand upright. The legend of 7 minutes was a dare whispered among the veteran staff and the local ghost hunters who lingered near the stone walls. It was said that if a person entered the isolation cell at the very end of Block 4 and remained for exactly 7 minutes in total darkness, they would be granted a vision of their own future. But the catch was the silence itself, which was a physical presence in the block. The cell was built with a double-layered stone wall that blocked every vibration from the outside world, creating a sensory vacuum that stripped a person of their reality. Most who tried the dare ran out screaming within 60 seconds, claiming the silence had a voice that knew their darkest secrets. Elias, driven by a cynical curiosity and a life that felt like it was going nowhere, held the heavy iron key to the isolation door. He did not want a vision. He wanted to prove that the darkness was just empty space and that the fear was nothing but a trick of the nerves. He reached the end of the corridor where the ceiling dipped low and the stones were damp with the condensation of 100 years. The door to the final cell was smaller than the others, a heavy slab of oak reinforced with iron bands that looked like the skin of an ancient reptile. As he slid the key into the lock, the metal screamed as if it had not been turned since the prison closed in 1971. The door creaked open, revealing a space no larger than a coffin stood on its end. There was no bed, no sink, only a single slit in the ceiling, known as the Eye of God, which was currently choked with dirt and the pale light of a winter moon. Elias stepped inside, and the transition was instantaneous and jarring. The sounds of the distant city, the sirens, the wind, and the hum of his own flashlight were cut off as if a blade had severed his connection to the physical world. He checked his watch, and the digital glow showed exactly midnight. He clicked his flashlight off, and the darkness was absolute and heavy. It was not the darkness of a bedroom, but a physical weight that pressed against his eyes and his chest. During the first minute, Elias focused on his breathing, trying to maintain a rhythm that would keep his heart from racing. He could hear the rush of air in his nostrils and the rhythmic thud of his heart pounding against his ribs like a hammer. By the second minute, the sound of his blood flowing through his ears began to roar like a distant ocean tide. It was a sound he had never noticed before, a biological machinery that was suddenly deafening in the absence of external noise. He felt his pulse in his fingertips, and the sound was like the ticking of a clock that was counting down the seconds of his sanity. By the third minute, the hallucinations began to manifest in the void. His brain, starved for sensory input, began to invent light where none existed. Tiny, jagged sparks of blue and red danced in the darkness like dying stars. He felt a phantom touch on his shoulder, a cold pressure that felt like a hand made of ice and ancient earth. He reached out to touch the stone wall to ground himself, but his fingers met only more cold and damp stone that seemed to vibrate with a low frequency. He felt a sudden and irrational panic that the door had vanished and that the room had expanded into an infinite black plane where time had no meaning. He checked his watch again, but the glow was gone, and the battery, which had been full moments ago, was dead. He was now truly alone with the silence of Cell Block 4, and the silence was starting to whisper his name in a voice that sounded exactly like his own voice from a dream he had long forgotten. Part 2. The Weight of the Unspoken. The fourth minute was when the walls of the cell began to breathe in a slow and agonizing rhythm. Elias could feel the stone expanding and contracting against his back, a rhythmic pulse that matched the beating of his own heart, as if he and the building were becoming a single organism. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the collective psychic residue of the thousands of men who had withered away in this block over a century of sorrow. He began to hear their thoughts. A chaotic and overlapping static of regrets, prayers, and curses that echoed through the marrow of his bones. They were not speaking to him, they were speaking through him, using his body as a resonator for their ancient pain. He felt his own memories being pushed aside to make room for lives he had never lived and crimes he had never committed. He saw the face of a mother he did not recognize and felt the sting of a cold Philadelphia winter from 1845 when the prison was still a new and terrifying experiment. By the 5th minute, Elias lost his sense of gravity and orientation. Without a horizon or a single point of light, his inner ear failed, and he felt as if he were falling through a bottomless shaft. He was tumbling through layers of shadow and time where the air grew cold and smelled of wet earth and ancient limestone. He tried to speak to anchor himself to his own voice, but his throat was dry, and the sound he made was swallowed instantly by the stone walls, as if the room was eating his identity. It was as if the room was a digestive tract for the soul, stripping away his name, his age, and his purpose. He realized then why the prisoners of the past had gone mad within these walls. It was not the isolation from others that broke them, but the fact that in total silence, you are forced to hear the parts of yourself you have spent a lifetime trying to hide or ignore. The silence was a mirror, and the reflection was a monster of his own making. The 6th minute brought the vision that the legends had promised. The darkness in front of him tore open like a piece of black silk, revealing a scene from a time yet to come in his own timeline. He saw himself, but he was older and gaunt, sitting in a room that looked remarkably like the isolation cell he was currently inhabiting. He saw his own hands shaking as he held an iron key, and he saw a figure standing in the corner, a shadow with a face made of gray mist and shifting smoke. The shadow leaned forward and whispered the exact date and hour of his death into his ear. The information hit Elias with the force of a physical blow to the stomach. It was not a warning or a possibility, but a mathematical certainty. The future was not a path you chose, but a cell you were already sitting in, waiting for the door to lock from the outside. He felt the weight of his entire life collapsing into a single point of unavoidable fate. As the 6th minute bled into the 7th, the atmospheric pressure in the cell spiked until he felt as if his eardrums were about to burst from the internal force. The whispers grew into a deafening roar, a cacophony of every scream ever uttered within the walls of Eastern State since the first stone was laid. The floor beneath him tilted at an impossible angle, and he felt hands, hundreds of small and cold hands, pulling at his uniform and scratching at his skin. They were trying to drag him down into the foundation of the prison, into the very dirt beneath the stone. They did not want to hurt him, they wanted him to stay and become a permanent resident. They wanted a new voice to add to the chorus of the silent ones who lived in the cracks of the masonry. Elias felt his grip on reality slipping away as the 7 minutes neared their end. He fumbled for the door, his fingers clawing at the wood until his nails bled and his knuckles were raw. He found the iron band and pulled with a strength born of pure and primal terror. The door resisted at first, held by the vacuum of the room and the weight of the shadows that clung to his back like wet wool. Just as the 7th minute ended and the silence reached its peak, the lock clicked with a sound like a breaking bone. The door swung open, and Elias tumbled out into the corridor of cell block 4, falling onto the hard concrete floor. The moonlight through the distant windows felt like a blinding explosion of white fire, and the sound of the wind outside was the most beautiful music he had ever heard. He lay on the cold floor, gasping for air, his chest heaving as he stared up at the vaulted ceiling and realized that the man who had walked into that cell was gone, and something else had come out in his place. Part 3. The Silent Passenger. Elias Thorne quit his job at Eastern State Penitentiary the very next morning before the sun had even fully risen over the city. He did not give a reason or wait for his final paycheck. He simply handed in his badge and the iron key to a confused supervisor and walked out of the gates without looking back. He tried to return to the rhythms of his normal life in his small apartment, but the silence of cell block 4 had followed him home like a loyal and invisible dog. In the quiet of his bedroom, he could still hear the rhythmic pulse of the stone walls expanding and contracting. When he closed his eyes to sleep, he saw the gray misted face of the shadow from his vision staring at him from the corners of his mind. The city of Philadelphia, once a place of vibrant noise and life, now felt like a thin veneer of color over a deeper and much darker reality that only he could perceive. He began to notice small and terrifying changes in his environment that defied logical explanation. His clocks would all stop at exactly midnight, regardless of whether they were digital or mechanical. He would find small piles of limestone dust in the corners of his rooms and on the pillow where he laid his head. Most disturbingly, he found that he could no longer speak above a faint and raspy whisper, as if a part of his vocal cords had been left behind in the isolation cell. It was as if a part of his very soul remained trapped in the masonry of Block 4, and the distance between him and the prison was shortening every day. He became a man of shadows, moving through the streets like a ghost in his own life. He avoided people and public places, fearing that if he got too close to anyone, they would hear the roar of the prison echoes still swirling inside his head. 1 year to the day after his 7 minutes in the cell, Elias found himself back at the towering gates of the penitentiary. He did not want to be there, and he had fought the urge for months, but his feet had carried him across the city while his mind was in a deep and heavy trance. The prison was closed to the public for the winter season, but the side gate was slightly ajar, as if the building itself was exhaling in welcome. He walked through the courtyard, past the crumbling exercise yards, where the spirits of the past still paced in circles. He moved back into the depths of cell block 4, and the air was warmer here, now almost inviting. He reached the isolation cell at the end of the hall and saw that the door was wide open, as if it had never been locked at all. He stepped inside the small, dark space and sat on the floor facing the corner where the shadows were deepest. He did not need a flashlight, and he did not need a watch to tell him that his time was up. He understood now that he had never truly escaped the cell a year ago. He had only been on a long leash like a bird tied to a stone. The vision he had seen of his older self sitting in the dark was not a future possibility, it was his current reality catching up to him in the silence. He reached out and pulled the heavy oak door shut, hearing the iron lock click for the final and permanent time. As the darkness enveloped him for the last time, Elias Thorne finally stopped fighting the weight of the stone. He opened his mouth and let out a long and silent breath that felt like the release of a century of tension. The bone walls of the prison breathed back in a perfect and terrifying harmony. The 7 minutes were over, and the eternity of the silence was just beginning to unfold. Outside, the city of Philadelphia continued its noisy life, unaware that one of its residents had finally found his place in the architecture of the damned. The eye of God in the ceiling was now clear, and the moon looked down on the man who had become a part of the stone. He was the secret of cell block 4, and he would wait there for the next man with a key and a dare to walk down the hallway. The Hanging Site at Whaley House. Part 1. The Architecture of an Execution. The air in Old Town San Diego carried the salt of the Pacific, but it failed to cleanse the heavy atmosphere that clung to the brick walls of the Whaley House. Thomas Miller stood in the center of the parlor, where the afternoon sun cast long, jagged shadows that looked like grasping fingers across the polished wood. As a historian specializing in the judicial architecture of the 19th century, Thomas knew that this house was not merely a family home, but a structure built upon a foundation of legalized death. Before the bricks were laid and the windows were set, this specific plot of land had served as the public gallows for the county. The most famous resident of the soil was Yankee Jim Robinson, a man who had been hanged for the crime of grand larceny in 1852. Legend said that Jim had been too tall for the scaffold and that his feet had scraped the ground as he strangled a detail that had etched a permanent stain of agony into the very earth beneath Thomas's boots. Thomas was not here for the ghost tours or the stories of heavy footsteps in the hallway. He was here to conduct a survey of the foundation because the house was shifting in a way that defied geological explanation. He carried a ground-penetrating radar unit and a thermal scanner, expecting to find shifting soil or a leaking pipe. However, as he moved the radar across the floor of the courtroom section of the house, the monitor began to display a pattern that made his blood run cold. Beneath the floorboards, exactly where the primary scaffold had once stood, there was a void in the earth that was shaped like a human figure in the midst of a violent struggle. The soil was not compact, but seemed to be in a constant state of flux, as if it were being churned by an invisible force. The temperature in the room dropped 30 degrees in a single second, and Thomas saw his own breath bloom in the air like a white shroud. He knelt down and pressed his ear to the wood, feeling a vibration that was rhythmic and slow. It was the sound of a heavy rope straining against a wooden beam, a dry and rhythmic creaking that echoed from the depths of the basement. The sound carried a frequency of absolute despair, a vibration that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the primitive core of his brain. He felt a sudden and sharp constriction around his own throat, as if an invisible cord were tightening with every breath he took. He looked up at the ceiling and saw that the chandelier was swaying in a slow and deliberate circle despite the fact that every window was closed and the air was still. The shadows on the wall began to lengthen and detach themselves from the furniture, forming the silhouette of a massive man with a broken neck and a head that hung at an impossible angle. Thomas reached for his camera to document the phenomenon, but his fingers were numb and unresponsive, as if the heat were being drained out of his body by a psychic vacuum. He realized then that the Whaley house did not just sit on top of the hanging site, it had incorporated the energy of the execution into its physical structure. The bricks had been fired in the heat of that day, and the mortar was mixed with the dust of the gallows. The house was a living battery for the final moments of Yankee Jim. Thomas watched in horror as a dark and viscous fluid began to seep upward through the cracks in the floorboards. It was not blood, but a thick black residue that smelled of wet earth and ancient hemp. The fluid began to coil around his ankles like a snake, pulling him toward the center of the room where the radar had detected the void. The walls of the parlor began to groan with a sound that resembled a man trying to scream through a crushed windpipe. The floorboards beneath Thomas's feet started to warp and split, revealing a darkness that was deeper than any shadow. He saw the spectral image of a thick rope descending from the ceiling, its frayed ends glowing with a sickly violet light. The loop of the noose expanded until it was large enough to accommodate a man's head, and it began to pulse in time with the creaking sound from the basement. Thomas tried to scramble backward, but the black fluid had pinned him to the spot. He was no longer in a historic museum in California. He was back in 1852, standing on the edge of the trapdoor with a crowd of silent witnesses watching him from the corners of the room. The house had decided that the hanging was not yet finished, and it needed a fresh soul to provide the weight that Yankee Jim had lacked. As the noose descended toward his neck, Thomas saw the face of Thomas Whaley in a portrait on the wall. The eyes of the patriarch were no longer painted, but were real and filled with a terrifying pity. The house was not haunted by the Whaleys, they were merely the caretakers of the execution ground. They were the ones who had to listen to the scraping of feet every night and the snapping of the rope every morning. The black fluid reached his knees, and the noose touched the skin of his throat, feeling as cold as an ice pick. The last thing Thomas saw before the light failed was the silhouette of a massive man standing in the doorway, his hands tied behind his back, and a look of infinite sorrow in his hollow eyes. The gallows were open, and the drop was waiting. Part 2. The Descent into the Hollow Earth. The pressure around Thomas's throat intensified until the world became a blur of static and gray mist. He felt the floorboards beneath him finally give way, not with a snap of wood, but with a silent dissolution into the black fluid that had consumed the parlor. He plummeted into the darkness of the crawl space beneath the house, a place that was never meant to be accessed by the living. As he hit the dirt floor, the impact sent a cloud of fine white dust into the air, and the smell of lime and ancient rot filled his nostrils. He scrambled to find his flashlight, and when the beam finally cut through the gloom, he realized he was standing in the very heart of the Whaley house's secret. The basement was not a simple foundation, but a cavernous chamber where the original wooden supports of the city gallows still stood embedded in the earth, like the ribs of a buried leviathan. The ground beneath his feet was not solid soil, but a mixture of crushed bone and gray ash that shifted with every movement he made. In the center of the chamber stood a massive vertical beam of oak charred by time and stained with the dark residue of the black fluid he had seen above. This was the king post of the gallows, the central anchor that had held the weight of Yankee Jim Robinson. Thomas moved his light up the beam and saw the deep grooves where the rope had worn away the wood over decades of phantom struggle. The creaking sound he had heard in the parlor was deafening here, a rhythmic and grinding noise that seemed to vibrate the very fillings in his teeth. He realized with a jolt of terror that the house was not sitting on the site, it was feeding on it. The brick walls above were acting as a chimney, drawing the residual agony of the execution upward to sustain the structure. As he moved deeper into the shadows, he saw a collection of small personal items scattered around the base of the gallows beam. There were rusted spectacles, a silver thimble, and a child's leather shoe. These were not relics of the criminals, but the trophies of the house itself, tokens taken from the Whaley family and their guests over the past century. Each object was coated in a thin layer of the black fluid, pulsing with a dim and sickly light. Thomas felt a cold hand brush against the back of his neck, and he spun around but saw only the shifting curtains of dust. The thermal scanner in his pocket began to beep, a frantic and high-pitched warning indicating a heat signature that was off the charts directly in front of him, yet the air felt like it was freezing his skin. He was standing in the presence of a thermal inversion, a hole in reality where energy was being sucked out of the world and into the void. Suddenly, the shadows began to coalesce into the figure of a man standing beneath the phantom trapdoor. It was not the massive silhouette of Yankee Jim, but a smaller, more refined figure wearing a Victorian frock coat. It was Thomas Whaley, the man who had built this house over a graveyard. His face was a mask of eternal regret, and his hands were frantically trying to scrub a dark stain from the gallows beam that would not disappear. He looked at Thomas with eyes that were leaking the same black fluid, and his mouth opened to reveal a tongue that had been replaced by a length of hemp rope. He reached out to Thomas as if trying to warn him, but the massive shadow of Yankee Jim emerged from the darkness behind him. The giant man looked down at the architect, his neck elongated and his eyes bulging with the pressure of the noose that was still tied around his throat. The giant did not attack with his hands. Instead, he began to walk in a slow and heavy circle around Thomas, and with every step, the ground beneath Thomas's feet began to sink. The lime dust rose up to choke him, and the sound of the creaking rope turned into a chorus of hundreds of voices, all gasping for a final breath. Thomas realized that the void he had seen on the radar was not an empty space, but a portal of condensed suffering. The house was trying to pull him into the foundation to replace the decaying memory of Jim with a fresh and vibrant soul. He saw the spectral rope descend from the darkness above its loop, dancing in front of his face like a living snake. The noose smelled of old sea salt and the sweat of a terrified man. It was seeking a neck to snap, and Thomas knew that if he did not escape this hollow earth, he would become the new anchor for the Whaley house. He lunged for the small access hatch in the corner of the foundation, his fingers clawing at the dirt and the shards of bone that lined the walls. Behind him, he heard the thunderous footsteps of the giant and the frantic weeping of Thomas Whaley. The black fluid rose up like a tide, covering the floor of the basement and threatening to pull him under. He reached the ladder and climbed with a strength fueled by pure primal adrenaline, feeling the cold wind of the gallows at his heels. Just as he breached the floor of the parlor and pulled himself back into the world of the living, he felt a heavy weight drop onto his shoulders. He looked back and saw a piece of frayed hemp rope lying on the floorboards right where he had been standing. It was still warm to the touch, and it carried the distinct scent of a man who had died in the sun. Part 3. The Noose That Never Breaks. Thomas Miller did not stay to pack his equipment. He fled the Whaley house as the sun began to set, leaving behind his radar unit and his professional reputation. He drove through the streets of San Diego with his windows rolled down, desperate for the scent of the living ocean to erase the smell of lime and ancient hemp from his skin. When he reached his small apartment, he locked every bolt and turned on every light, trying to convince himself that the shadows of Old Town could not cross the threshold of a modern high-rise. But as he sat in the silence of his living room, he noticed a faint, rhythmic creaking sound coming from the ceiling. It was the same sound he had heard in the basement, the dry, agonizing strain of a heavy weight pulling against a wooden beam. He went to the bathroom to splash cold water on his face, but when he looked into the mirror, he saw a dark, bruised ring beginning to form around his neck. It wasn't a surface bruise, it was deep within the tissue, a mark of internal strangulation that was manifesting in real time. He touched the skin, and it felt cold and fibrous, like the texture of old rope. The black fluid he had seen in the foundation was now seeping from his own pores, staining his collar with a dark, oily residue. He realized with a jolt of pure horror that the inheritance of the hanging site was not localized to the house. The energy of the execution had latched onto his biological frequency. He had become a portable gallows, carrying the weight of Yankee Jim's final struggle within his own frame. The air in his apartment began to thicken with the scent of jasmine and carbolic acid, the signature aromas of the Whaley parlor. He looked toward the corner of the room and saw a piece of frayed hemp rope lying on his carpet. It hadn't been there a moment ago. He picked it up to throw it away, but the rope moved in his hand like a living muscle, coiling around his wrist with a strength that made his bones groan. The shadows on his wall began to distort, growing into the massive, broken-necked silhouette of the giant from the basement. The giant wasn't in the room, he was in the light itself, a distortion of reality that was slowly erasing Thomas's world. Thomas tried to call for help, but his voice was gone. His vocal cords felt as if they had been replaced by coarse twine. He stumbled into his bedroom, and the ceiling seemed to vanish, replaced by the dark, open sky of 1852. He saw the spectral faces of the crowd looking down at him from the edges of his vision, their eyes filled with the same cold curiosity they had shown at the public execution. The noose he had escaped at the Whaley house was now hanging from his own ceiling fan, glowing with that sickly violet light. It wasn't waiting for him to step into it. It was moving toward him, guided by the unseen hands of the house's memory. The final drop did not happen in a courtroom or on a public square. It happened in the silence of a modern apartment. Thomas felt his feet leave the floor as the invisible rope tightened around his throat. He looked at the wall and saw the portrait of Thomas Whaley once more, the painted man now standing in the center of the room. Whaley wasn't there to save him. He was there to document the new record. He held a spectral ledger and wrote Thomas Miller's name beneath the entry for Yankee Jim. The house required a balance, a weight to counteract the centuries of shifting soil. As Thomas's vision began to fail and the black fluid filled his lungs, he saw the giant smile. The hanging was finally over, but the rope would remain, waiting for the next surveyor to walk across the floorboards. The next morning, the apartment manager found the door locked from the inside. There was no sign of a struggle and no evidence of a crime. Thomas Miller was found lying in the center of the room, his face peaceful, but his neck marked by a deep, permanent indentation of a rope that did not exist. In his hand, he clutched a small, frayed piece of hemp that smelled of sea salt and old wood. Back in Old Town, the floors of the Whaley house stopped shifting. The foundation was finally level, the void was filled, and the rhythmic creaking in the parlor was replaced by a deep, satisfied silence that would last until the next historian arrived to ask about the shadows. The 13th Rule of Bodhi, Part 1. The Souvenir of Ash. The high desert of the Sierra Nevada was a landscape of unforgiving gold and jagged silence, a place where the sun did not merely shine, but acted as a slow-moving furnace that baked the memory out of the earth. In the center of this desolation sat Bodie, California, a town frozen in a state of arrested decay. It was a place where time had suffered a sudden and violent cardiac arrest in the late 19th century. To the casual tourists who traveled the dusty road to the National Historic Site, Bodie was a picturesque relic of the Wild West, a collection of sun-bleached saloons and leaning houses that offered a glimpse into a rugged past. However, beneath the layer of picturesque nostalgia lay a foundation of concentrated misery. The wind here didn't just blow. It carried the dry, rattling whispers of 10,000 miners who had traded their lungs for gold. The park rangers who lived among the ruins lived by a strict set of regulations to preserve the site, but there was one directive carved into the back of a hidden, leather-bound ledger in the ranger station known only as the 13th Rule. Nothing leaves Bodie, not even the thoughts that entered it. Marcus Vance was a professional urban explorer and a popular skeptic who made a lucrative living debunking local superstitions on his digital platforms. He considered himself intellectually superior to the Bodhi curse, the widely circulated legend that anyone who took even a pebble, a shard of glass, or a rusted square nail from the town would be hunted by a string of catastrophic misfortunes. To Marcus, these stories were nothing more than a clever marketing tactic designed to prevent looting and keep the historic site intact. He had built a brand on being the man who stood in the dark and laughed at the shadows. On a dry, windless Tuesday in October, while the sun turned the surrounding sagebrush into brittle tinder, Marcus slipped away from the main tour path, his boots kicking up a fine, gray powder that felt more like pulverized bone than desert soil. He entered the old apothecary shop, a building that smelled of dried herbs, oxidized iron, and the metallic tang of ancient medicines that had long ago evaporated into the wood. The interior was a sanctuary of shadows, where light struggled to penetrate the grime-coated windows. With a swift, practiced motion, Marcus slid a small, ornate glass bottle from a sagging wooden shelf into his jacket pocket. The glass was an iridescent purple, a chemical reaction to decades of intense desert radiation, and it felt unnaturally heavy, as if the bottle were filled with lead rather than air. The moment his fingers closed around the glass, he felt a sharp, static pop against his skin, a spark of energy that made his vision swim for a fraction of a second. He ignored it. Smiling at the trophy he had secured, he thought of the thousands of views his video would get when he returned the item in a month, proving that he was still alive and well. As Marcus walked back toward the parking lot, the silence of the town underwent a subtle but terrifying shift. It was no longer the empty quiet of an abandoned settlement. It was the pressurized silence of a held breath. The wind, which usually whistled through the gaps in the timber, died down completely, leaving the air stagnant and thick. He felt the weight of the purple bottle in his pocket begin to vibrate. It was a low-frequency hum, a subsonic pulse that seemed to resonate with the calcium in his teeth and the marrow in his bones. He ignored the sensation, attributing it to the vibration of his phone or the slight lightheadedness caused by the high altitude. He reached his modern, high-tech SUV and drove away, watching the skeletal remains of Bodhi disappear into a swirling cloud of dust in his rearview mirror. The disaster struck the moment he crossed the official park boundary. His vehicle did not simply stall, it suffered a total mechanical disintegration. The engine block groaned with a sound of twisting iron, and the modern electronics flickered and died as if struck by an EMP. Marcus stepped on the brakes, but the pedal hit the floor with no resistance. He managed to steer the heavy machine onto the shoulder of the road, where the tires began to melt into the asphalt like black wax, despite the cooling evening air. Marcus climbed out of the wreckage, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped animal. He reached for his phone to call for roadside assistance, but the screen was covered in a thick, impossible layer of gray desert dust that appeared to be inside the glass, obscuring the digital display. He reached into his pocket to discard the purple bottle, desperate to rid himself of the catalyst for this madness. But his fingers did not meet the smooth surface of glass. They touched something cold, fibrous, and porous. He pulled the object out and recoiled in horror. The iridescent purple bottle had transformed into a piece of petrified human bone, a fragment of a jawbone with 3 yellowed teeth still embedded in the socket. It was still unnaturally warm, pulsing with a faint internal heat. The 13th rule was not a suggestion or a myth, it was a physical law of gravity. The town of Bodhi was no longer behind him, it was moving into his biological system. He looked at his reflection in the dead side mirror and saw that his eyes were clouded with the same gray dust. The desert was starting to claim the space where his shadow used to be, and the road back to civilization had vanished into a horizon of shifting ash. He realized with a sudden, bone-chilling clarity that the bottle hadn't been an object, it was an invitation, and the host was already standing behind him in the middle of the road. Part 2. The Marshal of the Empty Streets. The walk back toward the town limits was a descent into a waking nightmare where the laws of physics had been rewritten by the hands of the dead. Every time Marcus tried to walk toward the main highway, the road seemed to stretch and warp, the asphalt turning into a river of gray silt that pulled him back toward the center of Bodhi. The sun refused to dip below the horizon, hanging like a scorched, unblinking copper plate over the jagged peaks of the Sierra Nevada. It provided no warmth, only a dry, abrasive heat that felt like it was drinking the moisture directly from his blood. Marcus checked his pulse and felt a terrifying sensation. His heartbeat was no longer a fluid thud, but a dry, scraping rattle, like a handful of gravel being shaken in a wooden box. The dust he had seen inside his phone was now appearing under his own skin, forming gray, branch-like patterns that traced the path of his veins. As he crossed the threshold back into the town proper, the atmosphere shifted from stagnant to predatory. The abandoned buildings, which had looked so fragile and leaning during the day, now seemed to have straightened their spines, their windows reflecting a light that did not come from the sky. He saw a figure standing in the middle of Main Street, a tall man in a tattered duster coat that trailed in the dirt like the wings of a vulture. This was the Marshal of Dead Man's Gulch, the spectral lawman whose sole purpose was to enforce the 13th rule. He had no face, only a shifting vortex of sand and shadow beneath the brim of a wide, sweat-stained hat. In his right hand, he carried a heavy iron mallet, and in his left, a rusted set of shackles that didn't clink but moaned. Marcus tried to turn and run, but the dust on the ground rose up in rhythmic, sentient waves, coiling around his ankles like gray shackles made of bone meal. Every time he exhaled, the desert air stripped a layer of life from his body, leaving his throat raw and his tongue feeling like a piece of sun-bleached leather. His skin began to crack in geometric patterns, turning the color of the weathered timber that made up the town's saloons. He realized with a jolt of primal terror that the curse was not a streak of bad luck, it was a process of biological reclamation. The town of Bodhi was a closed circuit of matter, a zero-sum environment where every atom was accounted for. By taking the bottle, he had created a deficit in the town's inventory, a hole in reality that could only be plugged with his own physical essence. He stumbled toward the apothecary shop, his movements stiff and jerky, as if his joints were being replaced by rusted hinges. He intended to place the jawbone bottle back on the shelf and plead for his life, but the interior of the shop had transformed into something far more sinister. The shelves were no longer empty or dusty. They were filled with thousands of glass jars, each containing a terrifying piece of a former visitor who had dared to steal a souvenir. He saw jars containing locks of human hair that still twitched, wedding rings still attached to severed, mummified fingers, and even a jar filled with human breath that fogged the glass in a constant cycle of panic. These were the returned items of those who had tried to cheat the 13th rule. The marshal stood in the doorway, blocking the only exit, the sound of his breathing like the sliding of a shovel through dry earth. Marcus placed the petrified bone on the shelf, but the weight in his soul did not lift. It grew heavier, pressing him down toward the floorboards. The marshal stepped forward, the sound of his boots on the wood sounding like the closing of a lead coffin lid. He pointed a long, skeletal finger toward Marcus's own chest. The bone was not enough to satisfy the debt because Marcus had committed the ultimate sin. He had looked at the past and seen only a commodity to be exploited for fame. The bottle he had stolen had been the vial of last sighs, a vessel used by the town's doctor to collect the final breaths of the miners dying of silicosis. Since Marcus had touched it with the intent to possess it, those thousands of final, gasping breaths were now fighting for space inside his own lungs. The room began to spin as the gray dust filled Marcus's chest, turning his internal organs into dry, brittle parchment. He saw a vision of the men who had died in the mines, their faces gaunt and their eyes wide with the terror of a slow suffocation. He felt their thirst, their loneliness, and the agonizing weight of the earth pressing down on them. He was no longer Marcus Vance, the urban explorer. He was a living archive for a collective tragedy that had been waiting for a body to occupy. The marshal's faceless head tilted, and for a second, Marcus saw his own features, his eyes, his mouth, his nose reflected in the swirling sand of the lawman's face. The 13th rule was finally clear. To leave Bodhi, you must leave behind everything you are, turning your life into a permanent addition to the town's collection of ghosts. He felt his identity slipping away, replaced by the dry, relentless hunger of the high desert. Part 3. The Last Resident. The moon finally rose over the Sierra Nevada, but it was not the moon Marcus remembered from the world of the living. It was a cold, black sun, a void in the sky that cast no light, only deeper, more sentient shadows that moved across the salt flats with a predatory intelligence. Marcus sat on the floor of the apothecary shop, his body now as brittle as the ancient glass he had once coveted. He could no longer feel his legs. They had merged with the floorboards, the grain of the weathered wood growing through his skin in a slow, agonizing stitch. He was becoming a permanent fixture of the town's architecture, a new piece of arrested decay for the next generation of tourists to photograph and admire. He watched through the dusty window as the marshal patrolled the empty streets, the lawman's duster coat snapping in a wind that only the dead could feel. He realized then that the Bodhi curse was not a punishment, but a biological necessity for the town's survival. Without the periodic infusion of new souls and fresh matter, the desert would have reclaimed the buildings decades ago, turning the timber to dust and the glass to sand. The town was a parasitic entity that needed the energy of the living to maintain its grip on the physical world. Marcus Vance was the newest battery, a fresh source of memory and flesh to keep the timber from rotting and the glass from shattering. He watched his own hands turn into a pale gray wood, his fingernails falling off like flakes of old lead-based paint. He wanted to scream, to warn the world that Bodhi was not a museum but a trap, but his voice was now just the sound of the wind whistling through a knothole in the wall. He was the secret of the apothecary, the living evidence of the 13th rule. As the first light of a false dawn touched the town, Marcus felt his consciousness fragmenting. His memories of the city, his career, and his life were being filed away into the apothecary jars. He was being hollowed out to make room for the town's collective history. He felt the cold weight of the iridescent bottle returning to his wooden palm, but it no longer felt like a souvenir. It felt like a part of his own anatomy. The marshal stood over him one last time, tipping his hat in a gesture of grim welcome. The debt was paid, the vacancy filled. Marcus's eyes, once bright with the fire of a skeptic, were now two dull purple glass spheres, staring out at the empty street with a permanent expression of hollowed-out shock. The next morning, a park ranger found Marcus's SUV abandoned on the road near the park entrance. The vehicle was a total loss. The metal was rusted through as if it had been exposed to a century of acid rain, and the interior was filled to the ceiling with fine gray dust. There was no sign of the driver, only a set of barefoot tracks that led back toward the town and then simply dissolved into the sagebrush. Inside the glove compartment, the ranger found a small, ornate glass bottle of an iridescent purple hue. The ranger, a veteran who had seen this exact sequence of events play out many times before, did not touch the glass with his bare skin. He used a pair of long-handled tongs to carry the bottle back to the apothecary shop. He placed it on the shelf in its original spot, exactly where Marcus had found it. As he did, he noticed a new addition to the shop's interior, a life-sized wooden figure sitting in the corner, its face carved with an expression of such profound and realistic terror that it made the ranger's blood run cold. The mannequin's eyes, made of the same iridescent purple glass as the bottle, seemed to follow the ranger as he backed out of the shop and locked the door. Marcus wanted to reach out, to beg the ranger to burn the building down, but he was frozen in his wooden prison. He was the new guardian of the apothecary, a sentinel of the silent dust. He watched the tourists walk by throughout the day, their cameras clicking and their voices filled with the excitement of a day trip. He waited, with a hunger he could no longer explain, for one of them to reach for a rusted nail or a piece of weathered glass. He needed someone to take his place, to inherit the memory of the dead and the weight of the bone. Bodhi remained in its state of arrested decay, a beautiful and terrifying monument to the greed of the past and the hunger of the earth. But beneath the surface, the town was growing, one soul at a time, its foundations reinforced by the lives of those who thought they could take a piece of history without giving themselves in return. The dust continued to settle, covering the truth in a layer of gray, silent amnesia. Marcus Vance was gone, his digital footprint erased by a town that didn't believe in the future. The 13th rule remained absolute, and as the desert sun rose to bake the earth once more, the shadow of the new mannequin lengthened, reaching out across the floorboards like a hand, waiting for the next visitor to cross the threshold and make the same fatal mistake.